When it comes to discussions regarding identity, we typically talk about ethnic or tribal identities, or what you may term blood and soil identities. These are, of course, linked to the biological context within which a person is born into, or the immediate chains of bonds of familial and communal relationships that one finds himself in. However, there are many forms of identity which are fundamentally propositional in nature. These are identities which are based on more abstract ideals, things like truth claims, like a philosophy, a religion, even things like ideology, and arguably even things like culture. Although in practical terms these may be identitarian, in nature they are of a theoretical, more abstract, propositional nature. Now, in many cases, what happens is that the kind of tribalism which is usually present in the kind of blood and soil biological identities typically latches on to these propositional identities. That tribalism is projected onto these propositional identities and the conflicts which arise from them. Typically, these propositional identities are linked to a dominant cultural or ethnic group. For example, we can give the case of the Arabs with, in many cases, things like the Caliphate and Islam, the Europeans, and the Russians and the Slavs. We can talk about things like the United States, for example, in the case of the Europeans, or more broadly of things like liberalism, of various secular ideologies, and even before that of things like Christianity, which were typically understood to be the civilizational religion, so to speak. And then we could talk about things like the Soviet Union, which, despite being, of course, theoretically at least propositional in nature, based on the communistic ideology, it was very much linked in that immediate historical context to a lot of Russian nationalism, and it was very much a tool for the projection of the power of the Russian heartland. However, it is important to note that the more abstract or theoretical, and in particular universal nature of these ideologies may sow the seeds for breaking any possible monopoly of one fundamental group over that ideology. For example, with communism, you have the universal brotherhood of the workers. With liberalism, it can sow the seeds for this kind of multiracial or multicultural societies, as you can see in many Western countries, including the United States. And of course, in the case of Islam being linked to the Arabs, it isn't necessarily exclusive to the Arabs. In fact, Islam being a universal religion would not be attached to merely one group. And the same can be said for Christianity as well. Even though Christianity may have latched onto the civilizational identity of the West, in truth, it is a universal religion and so isn't specific to one ethnic group. And thus you can see that both Islam and Christianity have incorporated within their midst countless peoples and different cultures and different ethnic groups. Of course, even though there may have been issues and may have been countless problems with things like homogenization, with these faiths and, for example, different processes of empire and of conquest and of assimilation that may have occurred with both of these faiths, it's also important to know that their universal nature may have sown the seeds for resistance to that and for different groups to maintain their distinctive cultures separately from one another. And thus you can see from here that universalism can sow the seeds for a kind of homogenization and for a kind of attempting to assimilate different peoples into one broader culture, dominant culture, so to speak. However, universalism at the same time can include an acknowledgement of the natural diversity inherent to mankind and maintaining that diversity and incorporating that diversity within its own banner. And thus universalism can sow the seeds of both homogenization and of incorporating diversity into one's worldview and incorporating diverse groups of people into one's banner at the same time. And so again, you can see how ideology, religion, beliefs, or cultural norms and practices can create the basis for a kind of civic identity. It creates the conditions for a kind of propositional identity, in contrast to tribal or ethnic identities, for example. At times, like I have mentioned, that tribalistic instinct latches on to those propositional positions. For example, things like dogmatism, sectarianism, or extremism are very much expressions of a kind of ultra-tribalism in a more abstract theoretical manner. And we can see with things like quote-unquote fundamentalism, whether it be of the secular or religious kind, many of the same mechanisms and processes taking place, where there is an arbitrary, yet very real, designation of who is part of the in-group and the out-group, a arbitrary designation of what constitutes the in-group and the out-group, and a arbitrary designation of what is orthodox and what is not orthodox, aka what is the in-group of valid ideas and the out-group of invalid ideas. It's valid to say that whether it be the religious identities of the pre-modern world or the secular ideological identities of the modern world, you can see how they have all engaged in the actions of empire, of imperialism, of conquest, and even of crimes against various peoples. And one complaint that you often hear about things like the US empire, for example, or even of the past, let's say, Arab empires or the empires based on the Islamic faith, for example, is that they, based on that kind of universalism of which they project their model onto the rest of mankind, that their model is the correct model, for example, of governance or to attain salvation, that oftentimes when that is projected onto all of humanity, it leads to the consequence of not differentiating between different groups of people and thus allowing for peoples to be assimilated and subordinated within one broader dominant culture. Whilst that may be a valid critique on certain levels, absolutely, and one can absolutely acknowledge the crimes of these various governments or of these various political movements against different groups of people, it is also important to note that this universalism can in fact sow the seeds to destroy or break up the monopoly of any one group over that ideology or over that religion, and hence over the power or status quo of an empire or of a government, etc., etc. It is also important to note yet that this kind of universalism can in fact sow the seeds for breaking up these monopolies of any one group over these ideologies, all these religions, all these broader philosophies. And that is fundamentally because whilst universalism can give rise to things like homogenization, at the same time, universalism can simultaneously incorporate within its banner things like the natural diversity of humanity. It can incorporate these aspects of the human condition as well. Can in fact sow the seeds for this natural process of diversification, of this natural diversity to play out and occur. And you can actually see this within some of these ideologies or the way that these societies developed along those lines, where, for example, in certain liberal societies, of course, you saw the rise of these kind of multiracial, multicultural societies, in the West especially. And you can see how the various ideals of the American Constitution, for example, led to the challenging of certain injustices against certain groups of people, for example, against certain minorities in the US. And I think it's important to note that, of course, whilst it does not necessarily address all of the systemic issues, or it does not dissolve all of the systemic issues that face these different groups of people, it goes a long way in attempting to solve those issues. It goes a long way in sowing the seeds for those principles to take root and reach their full expression in challenging those things. And similarly with things like religion, whilst universal religions may perhaps at times give rise to processes of homogenization and assimilation. It can also give rise to processes of diversification and incorporating that natural human diversity within the banner of one's faith. Because ultimately, with many universal religions, in principle, as long as certain abstract theoretical principles are acknowledged, one can incorporate those diverse cultures within its framework as being different expressions of that natural human desire, of that natural human state of seeking God. Different groups of people practice religion in different ways. And yet, on a theoretical level, as long as they are seeking, let's say, this abstract notion of the truth, let's say, as long as they are following those abstract, perhaps, principles which those religions regard as true, there is no need to get rid of that natural diversity that comes in the form of various human cultures, various human languages, various human forms of even religious and worshipping expression, etc., etc. And you can see, of course, how Islam came to embody and involve within its midst various different groups of people, like the Persians, like the Indians. And you can even see how Islam may have helped sow the seeds of challenging the status quo of any one group of peoples over the faith or over the empires or the power of that time. For example, the Abbasids rebelled against the Umayyads for many different reasons, and of course not to whitewash what the Abbasids did, but rather to demonstrate that one of the ideological slogans that they had was that of Shu'ubiyya, the equality of all races, of all Muslims before God, regardless of racial or ethnic or tribal distinction. And this challenged the mistreatment of non-Arabs by the predominantly Arab Umayyad dynasty and the elites of the Umayyad dynasty, who essentially treated non-Arab Muslims as second-class citizens. You can also see this with Christianity, where whilst, let's say, for example, some have used Christianity to justify the oppression of certain minorities, perhaps, or not necessarily to justify it, but have allowed for those sorts of ideas to prosper within their communities and within the religious identities of their communities. Christianity has also been used to challenge a lot of that oppression and to pave that path towards peace and justice. Of course, Christ himself, being a kind of esoteric figure, has many important and profound teachings on humanity, on forgiveness. And some people may view them as naive and kind of wishy-washy, but in reality what they really are about, which is a profound spiritual teaching, is about humanizing others, humanizing people who you don't even agree with, stepping into their shoes and understanding the context within which they developed and why they have become the way that they have become. And thus, to love one's enemies isn't merely some naive slogan about just being wishy-washy or having no boundaries. It's about acknowledging the fundamental humanity even of one's closest or dearest enemies, that is. For example, we can see in the various movements which challenged racial discrimination, for example, in America or in the broader Western world, that many of them were quite religious figures, or indeed Christianity and Islam heavily influenced those movements. In particular with Christianity, of course, we can also see that Christianity, on the basis of those universal teachings, has given rise to many valuable teachings about individualism, the value of the individual before God, that man is made in the image of God, and hence the inherent value of man is immense. And, it's interesting that in the American Constitution, despite many of the founding fathers' quite heterodox beliefs in terms of Christianity, their deistic views at times, they mention in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, that, all men are created equal and that they are all endowed with the same inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Their Christianity informed their beliefs about the value of the individualism and of individualism as a whole. You can see how those Christian understandings of the value of the individual gave rise to those seeds that would be sown to challenge various forms of oppression. For example, how those values were used to challenge racial discrimination in the West, in the United States, in the broader civil rights movements, for example, under the likes of Martin Luther King Jr., who himself, was a preacher. He was a scholar of the Christian faith. He was certainly a knowledgeable man, and his Christianity informed his struggle against racial discrimination at the time. And hence you can see with propositional identities that they are very real forms of identity, and yet they are constantly morphing and changing. They are on discretely or specifically on ideological terms, these more abstract theoretical terms, so to speak. And they are morphing from one time to another. And whilst they are arbitrary at times in the application or may be linked to one dominant group, and tribalism may be projected onto them, they are quite vast in their implications on who they can accept as part of their in-group and out-group at times. And whilst they can be used to justify different acts of oppression, they can also be used as tools of ideological resistance to these various same acts of oppression, and they can be used to justify various struggles, various forms of resistance against what people may perceive to be oppressive or tyrannical.